Fellow board members of the Whitlam Institute, distinguished guests, my UWS colleagues and friends. As is our custom, I'd like to acknowledge the Darug people, the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're gathered this evening, and to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander friends among us this evening. It's my great pleasure on behalf of the University of Western Sydney and the board of the Whitlam Institute to welcome you all here to the Lennox Theatre this evening for our conversation with the Honourable Ms Julia Gillard, our country's first woman Prime Minister, our first Welsh-born Prime Minister. Ladies and gentlemen, please join with me in welcoming the Honourable Ms Julia Gillard. As the headline for this evening's event suggests, Ms Gillard has led a very public life. We've all come to know her in our own way, or at least we thought we did. Yet in the 6 days since the official launch of her memoir, My Story, it has become apparent that there is much we did not know and a clear desire on the part of a great many citizens to sit down with her and engage in conversation. This evening's gathering was sold out within a couple of days of tickets going up online, and it's but one of many opportunities for this rolling public conversation that has been opened by the release of her memoir. When it was suggested quite some months ago that the Whitlam Institute might host such an evening as this, there was not a moment's hesitation. There were several reasons for that. The idea sat very, very comfortably for an institute such as this, which is dedicated to rigorous but civil public conversation. We also thought that it offered an opportunity to explore matters of public interest with a Prime Minister for whom public policy really mattered. Finally, we greatly appreciated the opportunity to welcome back to the University of Western Sydney and to the Whitlam Institute a very good friend. Ms Gillard is no stranger to us. You might recognise the Ian Turbot Auditorium on our Parramatta campus among the photos in My Story, and when you buy your copy, I'm sure you'll immediately go to page 330, where I understand the University of Western Sydney is cited as, and I quote, a standout example of a big educator, reaching out to those who've traditionally been denied access to higher education. Very topical at the moment. On the 31st of March 2011, Ms Gillard, as Prime Minister, delivered the Whitlam Institute's inaugural Gough Whitlam oration. And on the 1st of June 2012, she returned to the Institute to announce a federal government grant of $7 million to complete the restoration of the historic female orphan school and to establish a permanent home for the Whitlam Institute and Prime Ministerial Library within its walls. I can assure you that this is one Gillard government initiative that will endure for generations to come, one among many. And on a personal note, I wanted to mention very briefly the last two occasions I had to meet with Julia. The opening in Darwin of medical education facilities at Charles Darwin University, establishing for the first time a medical program to train Indigenous doctors in the remote parts of the Northern Territory, and the opening of the Australian Centre for Indigenous Knowledges and Education. Enormously important initiatives delivered in the Northern Territory of enduring public benefit. Julia Gillard became Prime Minister in an uncontested leadership ballot on the 24th of June 2010. She won an election on the 21st of August that year and lost the leadership by 12 caucus votes on the evening of the 26th of June 2013. 3 years almost to the day. It is those 3 years which are the focus of her memoir, and it is those 3 years which set the scene for this evening's conversation. It's time to begin, so let me hand over to Eric Sidoti, our fabulous director of the Whitlam Institute, for our conversation with the Honourable Ms Julia Gillard.
Thank you. Julia, I'd collected about 3,000 questions for you while you were Prime Minister. I've culled them down a little bit for this evening. I've been immersed in your book for the last few days, and the more I've thought about it, the more it seems to me that it's a very important book, a very substantial book. So I'd really like to spend the short time we have for this conversation to explore that a little. Others here might have questions about Mr. Rudd, but I trust you won't be too disappointed if I don't. First though, before kicking off, I'm just curious as to what drove you to write my story and why now?
Why now? I think for me actually, I needed to write it now. I think I would have found it a far harder task to write it in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years' time. I found that the immediacy of it meant that your recollections were sharp and that you could put yourself back in the moment and feel the emotions again. I did have a period to, rest and reflect before I started the writing after being Prime Minister, a pretty short period, but a period. So I think for me now was the right moment. And in terms of the reception of the book, I think it's the right moment too. I wanted to have my say on this part of history, the 3 years and 3 days I was Prime Minister. I wanted to answer, 2 very big questions. One I would get asked all the time when I was Prime Minister, which is how do you do it? But I wanted to also answer the question that made the most, tugging at the heart for me, which is why did you do it? What's the purpose? What's the sort of policy story, the thing that drove you on? And so I think it's best for that to be received whilst memories of the government are fresh. I'm also really in the book calling on the nation to think through some complex issues like gender and leadership, and the sooner we get started on that, the better.
I would be returning to several of those themes,
Okay.
which won't surprise you. But one of the things that seems to me that you do in this book is that you combine what is a very personal story with a deeply analytic story about your experiences, and also, I think, about a description of the politics that were at play. But at the human level, there are so many good stories. I was really touched and struck, I have to say, by the story of your afternoons after school at the Sunset Lodge Eventide home with your mum. And it was very clear in the book that family for you runs very deep.
Yes. I have woven together the personal and political, and it's not a chronological memoir. It's not a sort of autobiography in the sense of, then I was born and then I went to school and then this happened and then that happened. But it is looking back on my family life and events in my younger life that shaped my attitude to issues. And so you do meet in the book my family, my father and my mother and the things that shaped them, because I can't really explain my passion for education and what drove me as Deputy Prime Minister and Prime Minister without explaining their story, because it's so important to who I am. And in Snapshot, that story is one of educational opportunity denied. My father and mother are Welsh, born in Wales, mum of Scottish extraction originally. But Dad was one of 7 in a coal mining village, an intelligent child, did very well at the 11 plus exams that they administered to young children in those days. Did that well enough in that to get a scholarship, but his family couldn't afford to not have him working, so he left school at 14. My mother, for a whole other set of reasons, didn't get full access to education, including a lot of ill health in her family. One of her sisters actually died of scarlet fever, an infectious disease that killed children in large numbers, but of course in the modern age is a relatively mild ailment because we can treat it. So both of them, my mother is still with me, my father I lost when I was Prime Minister, but they've had the opportunity to have, long, happy, successful lives. But there was always a wistfulness about what if they'd got full educational opportunity. And so that passion's been burnt into me since those family days. So I wanted you to meet them and to meet the child, the, younger version of me that did do things like sit at the aged care place where my mother worked as a cook and wait for her to finish her working day at 6:30 at night, which sounds all very Dickensian until you realise that, basically it gave me access to 80 grandmothers, so they just made a ridiculous fuss of me the whole time and helped me, learn to knit and cat's cradle and all the rest of it. So it really was a very delightful time in my life.
And that passion that you talk about is evident. It translates into your politics quite clearly. And you draw a distinction between the politicians driven by power and those driven by purpose, I think is the way you put it. So you've already mentioned education, but what drove you? I mean, what was the purpose that drove you in? Because you have to be motivated to endure.
Yes, you do. I look back on my experiences, and you're always wondering about the what if moments, and people have asked me during the course of talking about the book, what if your family had never migrated? And you just, you don't know. You don't know who that person would be, who I would be if I'd grown up in Wales and never come to Australia. What if, you hadn't had some of the experiences that shaped you as a young person? And one of those big experiences for me was going to university, which I thought was, a pretty big thing to do. Certainly from my family background, not a common thing to do. Out of my father's siblings, all 7 of them, only his youngest brother got to go on to higher education, and he was the much younger one. So by the time he was coming through, all of the older kids were kind of off the family's hands. So this was a special opportunity, and it's so long ago. It's the Malcolm Fraser government and the Philip Lynch Razor Gang. For the young people in the audience, they can look that up in the history books. But they, had an expenditure review committee and big cutbacks, including big cutbacks to higher education, which should be making many people think at this stage that, everything comes round again in cycles, doesn't it? And as a young person, with my background and my sense of belief in education, I thought that was wrong. And I got involved in active politics for the first time because of that. And having taken that step, I then took all of the steps afterwards, which took me to being Prime Minister. But if it hadn't been for that sense of purpose, this is important, it's not someone else's job, it's my job to be involved in protesting about this, then the rest would not have flowed. So that sense of purpose was there from very early on.
To jump forward a bit, because you see it through so much of the policy that you write about, and I really thought that the chapters and the writings that you explain around climate change are really important pieces of work. I mean, it seemed to me that you managed to articulate the principles, what the policy approach was, and just as importantly, the politics of trying to convert that into practice. I mean, it was a very succinct, accessible, articulate section of the book. And it just made me wonder that, don't you wish you'd written it 3 or 4 years ago?
I guess yes, has to be the answer to that. I certainly, in the book, put my hand up to a number of political errors, and of the political errors that cost me most grievously, the handling of carbon pricing was, top of the pops, number 1. And so if you, had your time again, I, in one television interview during the campaign, used the truncated form of words, there'll be no carbon tax, not the longer form of words I used in other interviews, but I don't rule out an emissions trading scheme. And then I didn't contest, as I should have, the characterisation carbon tax. I mean, I didn't wander around saying carbon tax, but I didn't argue it. I wanted to get onto the substance of the policy. Benefit of hindsight, a very naive decision to think you can get onto the substance that easily in modern politics. And so all of that then meant the underlying important policy, which is carbon pricing, got hitched to these issues about political honesty, and the debate ran the way the debate ran. But the fact that the underlying policy is robust, I think, comes through in that chapter and gives me a real sense of optimism that we will see a carbon price in Australia. It will happen. Good policy does win through, and it will win through in this circumstance. And here, at the Whitlam Institute, Gough could certainly tell us about good policies that took 2 goes through. Medicare, of course, is one of them.
Yeah. underlying all of that is this sense that the ground on which policy has to now be debated and negotiated and developed and then sold is more chaotic. I mean, one of the things that had happened to us at the Institute is that we came to the conclusion that the climate change issue, the missing piece, was actually the democratic challenges that are inherent in the climate change debate, and it seems to emerge from what you're saying there. So I don't know if it's stretching it too far to suggest that you almost write of the experience as a cautionary tale, it seemed to me, about policy making in our democratic institutions, and I include in that a lot of the commentary you have around the fourth estate.
Yes, I think it is a cautionary tale. I think that there are some hard to explain things about carbon and climate change, not only here but right around the world, and I try and tease this out in the book. I mean, overwhelmingly, Australians are rational people when it comes to accepting scientific research and scientific conclusions. And so, you know, in my own lifetime, the attitude to sun, you know, has entirely changed to whether or not you should be baking yourself to get a deep brown tan. Everybody wanted to be nice and brown and tanned when I was young. And now the scientists have told us, you know, too much sun, melanomas, worst melanoma rate in the world, don't do it. Scientific conclusions, and we accept the scientific conclusions. We put a hat on, we put sunscreen on our children, we make sure that they've got a t-shirt on. No one actually wanders around going, oh, reckon they've got that wrong. Reckon I'll put my 3-month-old out in the midday sun and see what happens next. You know, people accept what the scientists have to say. And yet when it comes to climate change, somehow, and this is, I think, because of the sort of campaigning of the kind of radicalised right, somehow we seem to have taken our ability to process scientific conclusions and put it to one side. And so when scientists tell us climate's changing, carbon, you know, what people are doing, we need to address this, individuals go, oh, I don't reckon that's right. I think I know more than a climate scientist, or Alan Jones probably knows more than a climate scientist. So there's, you know, there's all of this kind of kookiness going on, and it's not just here. I mean, it's going on in the United States. It's going on in many places in the world. So there's all of that. And then there's the sort of democratic problems you point to, that putting a price on carbon is a big reform agenda. There's lots of moving parts to explain. Who pays the price? How do we retain our competitiveness in this international world and global economy? How do we shield people from flow-through price impacts on things that they pay for? How does it work to reduce carbon pollution? And there's a lot about the current media age and the rapidity of the media cycle, which doesn't, you know, enable deep explanation. And that was one reason why early in the life of the government, indeed when we were creating the minority government, I came to one political conclusion about carbon pricing which was right, which is that people would finally make their minds up about it when they lived it, rather than being told about it when they lived it. And the experience once carbon pricing started was people were sort of settling with it. They didn't embrace it, you know, they didn't say, oh, I love the carbon price. But, you know, when the economy kept functioning, when the lights stayed on, when a lamb roast wasn't $100, people went, oh, it feels like it hasn't even started yet, maybe it's not that bad. And it was cutting emissions. So I think that's telling you that in today's world, the profound reform debates can sometimes be won on the arguments in the way in, but sometimes there just has to be the political force to start them up and then have people, you know, make the decision when they can see it work in their own lives.
Yeah, see, I reckon that's really interesting, because are you suggesting that we've actually seen a shift in the way that reform, as opposed to general policy, reform happens? You know, because you put forward the climate summit, you know, in an attempt to try and engage people and to, if you like, catch up on the engagement, seemed to me, on
Yes.
the engagement side of it.
Yes.
So are you suggesting that the anti-intellectualism, the negativity about science as such, and the, you know, this approach of knowledge that you describe, is it such that to really have major reform now, we're forced to actually go for it and then let it be lived and see it realised? and not have the Pride debate, or is it just a climate change issue?
I think there are some issues where you've just got to go for it, but not all issues, but some issues. The conclusion I draw across a number of environmental issues that I talk about in the book, so it's not just carbon pricing, but it's things like Tassie forests, it's things like marine parks, is, all the world has changed in terms of the contours of politics and who protests in the modern age. I mean, when I was, a young person back at the university making a, leaflet to protest about funding cuts, which was, quite an onerous job back then when you had to get out a IBM electric typewriter and a Roneo machine to complete the job. No emails for us. But back then, the side of politics that engaged in protest was the progressive side of politics. We were the people who wrote the petitions and stood on street corners and tried to inveigle passers-by into signing our petitions. Now, in the age in which we live, protest politics is as likely, indeed perhaps more likely, to be engaged in by the radicalised right. And we saw that in climate change, we saw it in the marine park agenda where, people were being told nonsense about you wouldn't be able to throw a line off a beach with your young child and go fishing. I mean, it was all rubbish, given how far out to sea the actual constitutional authority of the federal government is. Just nonsense. In Tasmania, people were being told this is all a, federal Labor government conspiracy, whereas it was actually about, the contending parties in the forestry debate coming together for the first time after decades of conflict. So the protesting was on the side of the right, the Conservatives. And so I think there's, I don't have all of the answers, but I think there are some things we need to think about out of this, about progressive politics and how you win through. We've relied often on winning the argument. I think in this age we're finding it, because of this protest politics on the right and the change in the media cycle, harder to win the argument. Now, that doesn't mean you ever give up on trying to win the argument, but it does mean there will be some issues on some occasions where you've just got to show rather than tell.
The part of this change, and you do talk about this in the book as well, is what's happening within the Parliament and the nature of public discourse. And you've covered some of that there. But as we know, you referred to Gough. Gough saw the Parliament and the sovereignty of the Parliament as absolutely central and the road to public reform. So what the hell's going on there?
Well, when you think of Gough's age, I think there's a whole lot of things that are going on. Number one, the issues of Gough's time were, I'm not trying to say they were all simple ones, but many of the issues of our time, I think, are even more complex than what Gough dealt with. To a large extent, the easy problems have all been solved, and the harder problems confront us now. So that's, one issue. Second, I think the nature of the relationship between the governed and the governing has changed. It is a more contested, perhaps fractious relationship than it's been in the past. The public having less trust in institutions than they used to, including in the institution of Parliament. The pressure on decision making and the white hot spotlight on decision making, I think, is harder and sharper than it ever used to be. And yet at the same time, we've got a splintering about what facts are and what information is. I mean, way back when, Gough, obviously, with his position on the Vietnam War, how did people get their information on the Vietnam War? Well, you'd watch the 6 o'clock news, and a father and a son could watch the 6 o'clock news, the son at risk of being drafted, and they might watch the footage on the 6 o'clock news and come to very different conclusions. The father that the war was justified, the son that he didn't want to go and he was going to join the protest movement. But they were watching the same images, the same facts were being presented to them. Now in this age, with so much information coming at you, in some ways you can look for the facts that help reinforce your opinion. So all of this, I think, is putting a pressure, and it's not just in Australia. I think you see it in US politics, you see it in UK politics. It's putting a pressure on the system. It's a disruption of kind of the rhythm in democracies, and it's helping breed a sort of snapshot hyper-partisanship. So, you know, if you're going to tweet it, you know, make it count, make it hard, make it sharp, and move on to the next thing really quickly, rather than, you know, the Goff approach, which would be to think about it deeply, discuss it widely, produce the manifesto, and then popularise the manifesto for years and years and years. If you took that approach now, you'd put the manifesto out at 11 a.m, and by midday, journalists would be ringing your office saying, "Have you got a story for me?" Oh, we just put the manifesto out. Yeah, I know, I tweeted it. Yeah, have you got a story for me? There's, you know, we're going to have to think through, and people in liberal democracies like our own, we're going to have to think through how we deepen the debate in the age in which we live. And I think we'll get there because the hunger for it will be enough, but we're not quite there yet.
Just before we open for a couple of questions, I think it's hopeful that you're saying it's not irretrievable, even if we don't know the answer. But still the role of Parliament, you make the point in here that part of the negotiations around the minority government was an agreement that there would be an annual report to Parliament on the Afghan war, and there would be a debate each year on that. It seems time's come around again. Are you at this point thinking that we should go so far as to make sure that the Parliament has a role in deciding to go to war?
No, I don't think that. I think national security decisions have to be the province of executive government. I genuinely believe that. I support Bill Shorten and the Labor Party's approach of bipartisanship on this occasion. But I would recommend to anyone and everyone the approach we ended up taking of having an annual debate on the war in Afghanistan. And that did happen because when I entered the agreement with the independents, they wanted to see a debate. So I said, yes, part of the agreement will have a debate. And then I decided to make it annual because, you know, when we look at the conflict in Afghanistan, mostly the only time people would receive news about that would be when we had lost a soldier. And so they'd get the dreadful news and then they'd see me and Mr Abbott at a soldier's funeral. I went to more than 20 soldiers' funerals. And, you know, the nation would grieve, as the nation should, for the loss of very young people in Afghanistan. But in all of that, there wasn't the explanation about why. And so the annual debate gave us an opportunity to explain why. For others who didn't agree with it, to explain why they thought it was wrong. For me as Prime Minister to be able to stop-take the progress. And I think when you are engaged in something as grievous and hard as fighting overseas and potentially losing lives, then that's a very appropriate process and a good use of parliamentary time.
Okay, we'll take a couple of questions. I've still got a string here. Now, as a courtesy, it'd be quite nice if you just identified yourself very briefly, and as we say, keep it short. Just over in the middle here. Oh, he's one of the Foundation volunteers of the Female Orphan School.
Look, my name's Brett. I'm actually going to ask this question for someone else. Will, I was lucky enough to meet a young lady who's in the second row there in the foyer who tells me, or her companion tells me, she's an aspirational politician.
Good.
So what advice would you have to probably the youngest member in the audience?
Oh, I see. Okay. Hello. How old are you? 6.5. And what's your name? And lovely to meet you. Well, my advice, I think it's really important you finish school, so you focus on that. My best advice for anybody who's thinking about politics is, and I think you've got a few years to think your way through this question, my best advice is really work out why you want to do it. What's the change, what's the difference that you seek to make through politics? because it's not an easy life. It's a good life in many ways. I mean, it's a fascinating life. You get to do amazing things, but it's not an easy life. And, you know, if the motivation is seeing your, you know, face on TV, then I think there are probably easier ways of achieving that. You could go on the block or something like that. If the, you know, motivation is to come into halls like this one and have people applaud, well, that happens some days, but there's plenty of days when people aren't applauding. So the thing that really sustains you through the ups and downs and makes it all matter is that you know that there are things that you really believe in, that you want to do, and that being a member of parliament, being a member of a government is the way of achieving those things. So over your many years to come, before you have to worry about entering politics, there's plenty of time to work out what those things are for you.
I might interpose though, I'm with the Jesuits. You're never too young to come to the Whitlam Institute. Okay? We've got an excellent schools program, we'll see you there. Okay, another question up the back there.
Okay, what I'm doing at the moment and focusing on, and you know, this is right for me at this stage of my life, so I'm sort of planning the balance out, however long that balance is, having just turned 53. I'm conscious of ageing this week. I'm planning it out based around the things that have always driven me, so education, opportunity. Having finished here with domestic politics, my eyes have obviously lifted to where else can I make that contribution. And fortunately, I've access to wonderful opportunities. I was invited by the think tank Brookings in Washington to join their Centre for Universal Education as a non-resident senior fellow, and that gives me the opportunity to help them and the wonderful researchers there think through some very complex policy issues about education globally. And I was invited to chair the Global Partnership for Education, which is the body that is the multilateral funder of education in the poorest countries in the world. We work in 59 developing countries trying to realise the promise that the world gave all of our planet's children, that by the end of 2015 there would be universal access to primary school. The depressing news is we're not going to make it because we're 58 million children behind where we should be, 58 million kids who don't get to go to primary school. But the positive news from what the Global Partnership for Education does, we can show that we can make a difference, and even in some very fragile, very poor, very difficult contexts to work in, places like Yemen, to give one example, we can make a big difference to enrolment rates, including enrolment rates for girls. So they're the things that are taking my time now, as well as talking about the book.
That's a nice, I'll come back to you just one sec, but that's a nice follow-up in the sense that education's clearly the fire that burns most fiercely in your belly. Yeah?
Yes, that's right.
And, you know, I think you'd be the most churlish person who didn't acknowledge what an extraordinary legacy you've left in education, you know, from early childhood, Gonski, through to the higher ed reforms, vocational education, which people don't talk about, interestingly enough. But having left office, what do you feel as if was left undone when it comes to education in this country?
Oh, look, I think, you know, many of those reforms still needed work and implementation to bring them to their full maturity. So, and I know that our school funding reforms, the last delivery of it will be one of the big contests of the 2016 election because the government in office has resiled from its campaign promise to fund all of those reforms. So, you know, there's that, the sort of patient work of nurturing it. There's always setting your sights on the next wave of ideas. I mean, education is never an area where you can go, oh, it's done now, it's perfect, because as we're trying to improve our education system, so is everyone else in the world. So there will always be new ideas, new ways of working. If I wanted to outline one area, though, that still presses on me and I think about a lot, is how we could, you know, drive even more in the early learning area. We expanded early learning for kids in the year before school. We expanded early learning for some of our most disadvantaged families, but I think that there is still a lot more work to do so that children right around the nation, including from the most disadvantaged circumstances, are getting the benefits of early learning from very, very early on, because, you know, the brain connections of babies and young toddlers are being made so quickly, so fast, and that happens to the fullness of its potential is critical to that child's later development.
The twin in your worldview, it seems, is work. You know, the
Yes.
dignity of work, the benefits of work, and what it all means. And I was really struck when I read the book. You make a lot of references to maximising jobs, high participation rates, etc., but there wasn't a single reference to full employment. And I just wondered whether that was intentional, whether the objective of full employment is dead and gone, or there's something else behind that.
Oh, no, not in my view. The objective of full employment is nowhere near dead and gone. But what do we mean by full employment? I think we mean not only creating jobs and good quality jobs for people who are presenting themselves to the labour market, but actually extending the reach of the labour market and participation in work. The things that most troubled me as Employment Minister and Deputy Prime Minister and then Prime Minister, you'll always get ups and downs in the economic cycle, so there will be some times when we've got greater joblessness than others, and we've always got to fight for maximising employment. But even in the best of economic times, there are many parts of our country where there is large-scale joblessness and welfare dependence because people haven't had the opportunities that education brings, the supports to get into work. For them as individuals, that means they are pushed onto society's margins. That disadvantage is likely to be intergenerational. If they don't work, it is more likely their children won't work, and once again will be welfare dependent for their lives. And from the point of view of an ageing nation, I mean, the last thing you want is working age adults not in the labour force because you didn't do everything you could to extend them an opportunity. So I think that sense of work and inclusion and purpose is, you know, very important to combating disadvantage and very important to maximising what we can be as a nation.
If I can push it just a little bit, because absolutely, you know, I agree, obviously, but it is the reality that there is still a structural issue, isn't there, underlying the fact that, you know, our non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment is close to 6% at the moment, and we sort of try to treat that as, well, aren't we good when we get under 5%? Underemployment's huge. We all know this, you know. So it's not simply, is it? It's not simply about having the skills in the modern economy. There's something else at play.
It's not. There's two. You know, there's a demand and supply. You know, the two sides of the equation. And on the demand side, there's, you know, I mean, and I talk about this in the book, what I referred to as the patchwork economy. You know, it'd been fashionable to talk about a two-speed economy, those who are in the fast lane of, you know, mining and everything that mining can bring, and those that were in the slow lane, you know, the manufacturing industries. I actually looked at it and thought it's much more finer grained than this. You can be in a mining state like WA and you can still be in a part of that state which has a depressed economy and isn't offering young people the benefits of apprenticeships and all of that. So let's have a real understanding of place, of joblessness within place, of underemployment within place, and what can we do with the rigours of a global economy to still nurture a diversified economy here that's got many sources of strength and consequently many entry points for opportunity, not just one entry point or a preferred entry point. It's quite hard to do, but I think it's that, the nurturing of a diversified economy, as well as the development of skills and work capacity that gives us the maximum prosperity and inclusion.
Thank you. Now, I promised you to go back up to the top there.
Hi. Okay.
I think what truly is remarkable about your personal story is at the end of the day, people weren't looking at your achievements of what you achieved policy-wise. They were looking at your, I guess, your personal life. And I just want to, and I guess your career was a hard slog. You worked as a lawyer, you worked very hard as a politician, and it wasn't easy. So I just want to get your thoughts on, you know, as a young person in the middle of my career, what would you say, you know, when you get those really difficult days, like what motivated you to keep on pushing, I guess?
That's a good question, and look, you know, there are plenty of days in my life, my professional life as a lawyer, and then as a politician, where you just think, oh, you know, the 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Oh, you know what? How am I going to get through the rest of this? Plenty of that, you know. So there's, you know, always the question of sustaining your energy levels and your enthusiasm and all of those things. But for me, because I was very clear on what I was in it for, what mattered to me, even on the hardest of days, I could, you know, touch that sense of purpose that was driving me on. And one of the things I talk about in the book, and I would recommend it to people, is when I became Prime Minister, a friend of mine, a man called Alan Milburn, who had been a cabinet level minister in Tony Blair's government and been very pivotal to the project of modernising British Labour, he said to me, what you should do is you should write out your purpose as Prime Minister, and then on the really tough days you'll have it, and it'll be a good galvanising tool as well for the team around you, for people to be clear about purpose. And he said, I've given this advice to a lot of political leaders, you should do it. And so I did dutifully write out my statement of purpose, and it's produced for you in the book. And I emailed it to Alan, who then somewhat sheepishly said to me, oh, I've given this advice to a lot of people and you're the only one who's actually ever done it. So there we have it. So let me pass Alan's advice on to you in the hope that some might take it up. He will be delighted if people do. He'll think his success rate is climbing. But it did, you know, it did help. It's a sort of steadying thing. And I mean, you know, not every life is full of the kinds of pressures you face as Prime Minister. Kind of by definition, not everybody gets to be Prime Minister. But I think all of our lives today, you know, there's always been the tension between the urgent and the important, the getting done what needs to be done this minute, as opposed to carving out the quiet time that lets you work out where am I going to be next year, 5 years, 10 years away. Never has that tension been more acute than it is in the modern age, when everything happens as quickly, and probably half of you have looked at your phones during the course of this because you're worried about the emails that are pinging in. You know, the urgent is just so on us. And so with that, you know, sense of urgency that we live with, the need to retreat, to think, to reflect, to have a clear sense of purpose, I think is more pressing than almost at any other time. So I would recommend it. A weekend without the phone, where you write it out and think about it deeply, and then you've got it there on the hard days.
We might give someone an opportunity over this side of the room.
Mine's a follow-up from the very first question. I'm hoping that shortly there'll be a female president of the United States and that Hillary Clinton will get in. What would your advice be to her? And do you think she's going to have to put up with the same misogynist rubbish that you had to put up with?
I actually spent part of last week in New York with Hillary Clinton. We announced a girls' education initiative together, which we've been working on for some time, which is mobilising more than $600 million into girls' education around the world. But even with that exposure, I'm not here to give you the international scoop about whether or not she's going to run. I don't know. I don't know anything more about that than anybody else in this audience. What I don't think, as seasoned a politician as Hillary Clinton really needs my advice, but I would say, you know, last time Hillary presented and ran in the primaries, there was some very sexist things said and done. And there was, you know, a sense maybe and I've had this conversation in the United States of, oh, you know, that's just because it's Hillary. Well, no, it's not because it's Hillary, it's because Hillary's a woman. And, you know, in the chapter I found hardest to write in the book, the one I've entitled The Curious Question of Gender, you know, one of the conclusions that I'd take out of working through all of this and presenting it before you to provoke your conversations and your thoughts is the burden of addressing any sexist conduct actually shouldn't be on the woman who is running for office. It should be on all of us. And, you know, one thing, you know, I think could have made a difference for me, and I really wish it happened, is, say, for example, during the carbon pricing debate, when it was all getting a bit ridiculous with Ditch the Witch and all the rest of it, it would have been really good if, you know, a businessman from a leading, you know, Australian company, and I think even if he'd framed it as, you know, I don't support carbon pricing, I didn't vote for Julia Gillard in 2010, I'm not going to vote for her in 2013, but we do not conduct our public discussion like this. That I think's got the power to change, and so I guess the only advice I'd give, not so much to Hillary but to Hillary's people, is of all the many preparations that appear to be underway in case Hillary does decide to run, I hope maybe some thought is given to preparations about who, not people within politics but people beyond politics, might be prepared to say that in the interests of, you know, American democracy, and if they interceded in the interests of American democracy, then that would reverberate around the world.
Just out of curiosity, did any of those business leaders contact you privately and not go public, or did they just stay silent?
No, I think the debate got so hot so quickly that it, you know, I mean, there were business leaders in the debate in support of carbon pricing, that did happen, but and there were a number of business leaders who, you know, said things to me supportively, some leading Australian women business leaders who said things to me supportive privately, but there was never as much engagement with that agenda as I think there should have been. Now, you know, you don't get to go back in time, so sort of that is what it is, and I don't seek to recontest all of that, but I think we can learn from it for the future.
Where are we? Sorry, we'll just take one in the middle here.
Hi, my name is Mitch.
Sorry, over here.
Oh.
We'll take you and we'll come back to you, Mitch.
Sorry.
We'll make sure you get your chance.
Okay.
I'm currently in the process of reading one of your former colleagues' books, Mark Latham's, and he talks about this idea of this disengagement between Australian politicians and the Australian public. And I noticed through my high school, university, and now my young professional career that I feel as if young people aren't as interested or engaged in politics as I feel that they should be. And I just wanted to know if you noticed that, or if you think that that's the case during your political career, and why you think that is.
I think there has been. I haven't read Mark's book. One of the things, you know, I've got them stacking up. But whilst I was writing, I didn't want to, you know, read a whole lot of books, particularly books about my time in politics and my time as Prime Minister, because I didn't want other people's voices in my head when I was writing. So I only departed from that on a couple of occasions. I read Greg Combey's book because I had the great honour of launching it, and I read Philip Chubb's book on climate change and carbon pricing policy. But I've got a big reading list for Christmas for summer. I think there is merit in the analysis that there's more distance now and engagement by members of the public in politics. I think there's more distance, you know, but we are not in an age of joining in terms of, you know, physically joining things. You know, the Labor Party, the Liberal Party, like many other sort of volunteer-based organisations that have worked on attendance as your way of getting involved, are suffering. you know, the days that you would wander around to a house or a pub in your suburb for your monthly Labor meeting and think that that was a really engaging thing to do, those days are gone, or going, in favour of different ways of engaging, from, you know, get up to tweeting out yourself about things and all the rest. So with all of that, I think there's been some ossifying of the political model, and so it's not reaching out to people the way it should. There's, you know, more cynicism around about politics, more, you know, less belief in the power of government than there used to be. I think those things are to be regretted. I think maybe the political class, and I'm happy to own this myself, we haven't covered ourselves in glory in playing politics out in a way that engages people and keeps their interest. So there's, you know, a range of things for us to do. My political party needs to modernise so we can capture people into discussions more easily. I think we've all got to be on a mission to reaffirm, you know, trust in government and the ability of government to make a difference. And we've got to find a way of mastering this new age of media where, you know, the rhythm of governing is kind of different than it used to be, but we haven't quite found the new rhythm. And even looking at, you know, people like President Obama, who was a master of social media and new media in campaigning, even he, in the, you know, hard days of governing, has found it hard to keep up the information flow and the engagement. So it's not like anybody's, you know, cracked this nut, but I think we've all got to be focused on how we can do it. Because, you know, at the end of the day, government is important and what it provides is important, and the more people are engaged in the policy thinking and the work and the debates of government, the better.
I think
So
we'll go to Mitch, but
Yes.
it does occur to me that, you know, I keep waiting for the Labor Party to buy a publishing house, you know. There are so many books in this cash-strapped period. Just up here, Mitch.
Yeah, just before, I can understand how boring it is to go to ALP branch meetings every month. It is very difficult. But the question I just wanted to ask is, obviously as Deputy Labor Leader and then Deputy Prime Minister, you say you didn't expect to become Prime Minister on the day that you did, but surely for many months or even years before that, you had an idea of, if you ever did have that job, what are the driving things that I wanted to, apart from education, which I think you've covered extensively, what were the achievements you really wanted to have, and what were the ones that you wanted to have but you didn't quite get there because your time was cut short?
Sure. I mean, I always had a very clear sense of, you know, my values and the things that mattered to me. I didn't... The way in which I became Prime Minister meant I didn't have the, you know, many months of planning and expectation. But I was clear on the values and the things that mattered to me most. Education, we've obviously talked about. Work and the benefits that come with work, we've talked about too. But I wanted our nation, you know, when I got to the position of Prime Minister, I had a very clear sense that we are living in an age that could be one of remarkable opportunity for our country, what I came to term the Asian century. I wanted to explain to our nation all of the, you know, possibilities that lay before us, both positive and some risks. And I wanted to make sure that we understood the best preparations that we could make for the time in which we live and the times of change we are yet to see. And so that's what led me to publishing the white paper on Australia in the Asian century and reinforcing the things we need to do to be ready, to be as productive as we can be, which brings you to education and skills, but also brings you to the NBN, it brings you to carbon pricing, to having an economy that can grow without growing its carbon pollution. Brings you to, you know, not necessarily very sexy topics like Commonwealth state relations and reducing regulation, but all of these things are important to our future. It brings you to Asia literacy and understanding what's going on in our region of the world. So I had a real sense of the possibilities for the future and tried to govern with that. I also had a real sense too that, you know, because this conversation we just had, government's important. You know, growing up in the family I grew up in, you know, government services were important to us. I mean, our education was going to be as good or as bad as what was provided in the local government school at the end of our street. You know, our ability to go to the doctor was going to be as good or as bad as Medicare was. So, you know, government services can make and support lives. And I wanted to extend that suite of government services. I was absolutely persuaded of the merits of the National Disability Insurance Scheme and wanted to push through on that, and delighted that we managed to do so. So all of these things were very important to me for the future.
Up the back there.
Hi, I'm a big fan, and I celebrated the night when you became Prime Minister. But one of the things that I've been most disappointed by was the stance that you took on same-sex marriages. I understand that in a legal sense, it's unlikely to make much of a difference for same-sex couples. But in a symbolic sense, and I think we saw that when the ACT allowed same-sex marriages for those 2 short days, I think that it was. Just want to see whether or not you recognise the symbolic importance of it, and whether or not your views on it have changed.
Sure. Well, I'll probably disappoint you by saying my views haven't changed, and I do talk about this in the book, and talk about, you know, my entry point to these kind of discussions, which is a long time ago. When I first went to university, there was a very active gay rights lobby, gay rights movement, and the aspiration then was not about taking a traditional institution like marriage and changing it. It was about carving out, you know, a new way of being and relating and having relationships that matter and could be recognised as mattering, but, you know, mattering very profoundly, but not taking the institution of marriage and sort of stretching it into a new sort of way of being. So, you know, they're the days in which I formed my views. And if you talked, you know, if I could get in a time machine with you and go back to Adelaide University in the early 1980s, or Melbourne University in the days I was there, you wouldn't find anybody who was lobbying for equal treatment of gay people, lobbying for gay marriage. It was a different time and a different view of what equality could be. Now, I recognise that views have changed, and now the majority, but not all, of those who want to see gay rights are lobbying for a change to marriage. So I thought the best contribution I could make to that was not, you know, to change my view. I'd formed my view. But to make sure that there was nothing in my political party that imposed one person's views on another. And so I ensured we had a conscience vote within Labor. And I think the, you know, next step in all of this, and it's an appropriate step, is that there should be a conscience vote across all of the Parliament. Because for those who do want to advocate change, it is impossible that there will be change in Australia if there is block voting by the Liberal and National parties against. There will never be enough Labor votes to, you know, make sure, because there will be Labor people of varying views. But even when Labor was in government, and in government by a long way, there would not be enough Labor votes to get it through the House of Reps and the Senate. So I think that's the next important thing.
In the book, we'll come back to a couple more questions in a sec, but in the book you don't dodge the thorny issues.
No.
And of course there's the thorny issue of refugee and asylum seeker policy, yeah? And I don't know if I was reading it through my own eyes, but it seemed to me that there's a bit of an edge to what you wrote in that section. You talk about the complacency that crept in, where in a sense the policy was softened, it was misguided and so forth, and the characterisation of those who didn't agree with the policy seemed quite strong, I think. Is that fair reading?
Yes and no. The harshest words, I think, in the book on refugee and asylum seeker policy are saved for the performance of the opposition when we were in government. And they obviously concluded that it was in their political interests to see the maximum flow of boats. And so anything that we sought to do that needed legislative approval, they were going to twist and turn and to block. And I think that was, a very wrong set of decisions, not only wrong-headed politically, but wrong by the nation. On the substance of the policy, this is never an easy area, and one where you get, torn in different directions. I think, by instinct, and I think most Australians actually are very compassionate people, and we do want to see, people in desperate circumstances looked after. I am for increasing the refugee intake. That's something that we did do as a government, and for helping out more people who have, fled from war and persecution, natural disaster. But I've, read too many reports about asylum seeker boats lost because, while sometimes that's visible, a lot of the times it's not visible because it happens right out at sea, and so you do, as Prime Minister, end up with the reports even when people haven't seen any pictures on their TV screens. We've lost too many lives at sea for, in my view, anybody to labour under the misapprehension that, extending an approach which encourages people to get on boats is the right way forward. I do think some complacency came into the Labor Party about these issues, having, when I was Shadow Minister for Immigration, taken a pretty tough-minded position. I understand why people struggle with these issues, but I don't think that we can let that kind of complacency come into the dialogue. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be honestly held, sincerely held and different views, but, we've got to, make sure all of that debate is held knowing that there are people overseas, people smugglers who are looking at our domestic debate and trying to work out how they can construe it to better profit off people who are in miserable circumstances.
The policy is morphing into the core elements of a bipartisan approach in many respects, I think you'd have to say. And notwithstanding the concern about the sinking of boats, which obviously is horrific, but I can't imagine you'd be happy looking at what the outcomes of that policy are in terms of people's lives. Roughly 1,200 people on Manus, 1,200 on Nauru, 24,500 here, plus about the same again in terms of about 10,000, I think, something like that, who are in onshore. The impact on our foreign policy, it's affected our core bilateral relations in the region, the effect it's having on the international law framework, which the Labor Party fought for. Do you feel comfortable with all of that?
Oh, look, it's not an easy, area. So, yes, there are hard things and hard things that make people feel uncomfortable, and they're difficult, and when you look at the outcomes of some of the policies, yes, I can share that set of concerns. But you've got to run the what ifs, and if the what ifs is more people setting sail and more people drowning and dying, then that's also something that should press heavily on us. On the regional relationships, I mean, the set of issues here, there is some concern in the region about flows of people and the profiting of people smuggling. It is understandably for a number of countries in the region, and I talk about this in the book, particularly Indonesia, not a first order of business for them. It's not the same order of business for them that it is for us, given the country that they're governing, and they're still hauling people out of poverty, and there's still much work for government to do. But I think that over time there's the capacity, working with Indonesia, working with countries like Malaysia, to have better regional approaches than we've seen in recent years.
Thank you. Okay, I think we're due for one on this side of the room, just up here.
Okay.
And then we'll cut across back over to here. Be patient with me, up there and then down here. So we'll take the three.
I've got a quick question. There's been a lot of discussion around policy, which I've quite enjoyed, but there was a lot of discussion around leadership when you were Prime Minister, both in terms of how you took the leadership in terms of removing a sitting Prime Minister in the first term and in terms of how you lost your prime ministerialship. I just wonder, with the benefit of hindsight, do you wish you'd done it differently or it played out differently? And how much time did you spend trying to protect your back when you were in the leadership role?
Well, someone would easily conclude not enough, wouldn't they? Look, on 2010 and the circumstances in which I became Prime Minister, I do talk about this honestly, and obviously much of it is a painful set of recollections for all concerned in the book. I talk about it in the first section of the book that deals with the, how did I do it, which tries to share some insights on resilience. In order for any of that to make any sense, I needed to explain, what it was for me that was requiring me to show resilience, what were the circumstances I faced. And in the book, I don't try and canvass, the pressures that are on any Prime Minister that are routine but onerous for anybody who steps up to be Prime Minister. I try and canvass the special pressures that were there for me, which I see as, minority parliament, this curious question of gender, and then the internal destabilisation that I faced. I explained through my eyes what propelled me into the Prime Ministership in 2010, where I thought I had no option, given the circumstances the government was in, but to put myself forward for the leadership. And then I talk about the consequences of destabilisation across the period of me being Prime Minister. Actually, though, day by day, this was, the internals, the Labor internals, were not the things that were at the forefront of my mind. Obviously, I was, conscious of them. I picked up newspapers very regularly early in the morning that screamed about leadership, so of course I was conscious. But, my day-to-day time I devoted and wanted to devote to the business of governing. And in many ways, I thought if we could get the governing right and the policy right and the big things right, then the leadership questions in some ways hung off how we were succeeding in governing the nation and how we were succeeding politically. And these two questions in my mind should be related, your purpose and how you're being perceived by people. People will make their own judgments about all of this, and many people will make judgments about these circumstances that are different to mine and the ones that I offer in the book. But I do, in the book, put very clearly my view that one of the things that concerned me about the destabilisation and the period I faced is that we started to have a conversation about leadership in the Labor Party that was devoid of a sense of purpose. Political leadership, at the end of the day, isn't about, social media presence. It isn't about taking selfies. I do volunteer the analysis that if these are the hallmarks of Labor leadership, why don't we ask Kylie Minogue to do it? She's very big social media presence. I'm sure wherever she goes, people cluster to get their photo taken with her. Leadership is about something else, and leadership in a democracy has to be about purpose and the popularisation of purpose. You need people to vote for you, and you can't be, naive or silly or Doris Day about the second, but you do need to have the first. And if there's one, sort of cautionary tale to take out of all of this from this past history for the Labor Party in the future, that cautionary tale, in my view, is that in assessing leadership, its purpose that at the end of the day is the bedrock and the thing that matters.
Now, the modern curse of time is upon us. So I promised 2 more questions, and I don't want to break any core promises. So can we bundle up? Can we bundle up the 2? If you tell us your question, and if you can tell us your question at the front, and Julia, if I could ask you to perhaps handle them as tandem.
Okay, my name is Chris. I was just wondering, I've always taught my daughter that Ginger Rogers did everything that Fred Astaire did, on high heels and backwards. There's nothing about a woman that makes her less of a man. You said that whoever should come along behind you, a female, should find it easier. Do you really think that the establishment will allow a female to do it easier than you were able to do it? And that's my question.
Okay, thank you.
Kareem from New Zealand. Thanks, Julie and Eric. My question is just about Australia's security alliance with the USA. And I wonder if you got any comments on Malcolm Fraser's recent book, which calls into question that alliance. At the moment, you see Australia supporting the United States with ISIS. Is that going to make Australia more of a target? This is an issue in New Zealand at the moment. They're questioning, should we, New Zealand, join this action? Appreciate your comments on that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. It's kind of going to be hard to bundle those 2 questions up together.
What a very good call on my part.
So I'm going to have to answer them one at a time. To take the security question first, there's a chapter in the book about the 1961 kids, because I was born in 1961, President Obama was born in 1961, and so was John Key. Prime Minister of New Zealand. I'll allow people to come to their own conclusions about whether or not that means it was a good year. On the alliance, I think that this is a foundation stone for Australia now and into the future. In our changing region of the world. The alliance has not only served us well in the past, but as our region changes, I'm an optimist. I think we will see our region change and grow in ways that are done peacefully. But you always need to be prepared for a future that has some risks in it too. And in this era of change, with strategic weight changing and the rise of China and all of the things that are reshaping our region and our planet, I think our alliance with the United States stands us in good stead. The values that we share are strong and common. We're, of course, our own independent country and make our own choices, but I think one of our continuing choices should be to be in that alliance. On the current security situation, I think it is a good thing that the Labor Party's extended bipartisanship to the government, and I think that's the right judgment call. So I know these debates play out a bit differently in New Zealand. For a long time they have, but that's my call about here and for us. On the question of gender, I genuinely do think it'll be easier, and I think it will be easier because in many ways the fact that we had the first woman to be Prime Minister, me, caused us to start having the kind of conversations we need to have to support and enable more women to come forward for leadership positions. And by that I don't just mean political leadership. We should have our eyes too on what's happening in corporate boardrooms. As Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, I went to a lot of corporate boardroom lunches for discussions, and there were many times when the only other woman in the room was the woman who was serving the lunch. So we need to be fixed on that too. We did a lot to change the composition of our judiciary and to appoint more women, including to the High Court. But we're not throughout our legal profession at equality yet. We're not there in our defence force, and the list goes on and on. And this conversation isn't just being had here in Australia, it's being had, right around the world, whether it's the book Leaning In or whether it's other, contributions that have sparked debate. This, I think, is increasingly being identified as the unfinished business for gender equality in our nation and nations like ours. And I think it's really about overcoming the kind of siren song that's in the back of our brains that still reinforces cultural stereotypes and leads us to look at women leaders and, decide, and the whisper in your back of your brain that women in leadership somehow are harder boiled and less empathetic than men in leadership positions. And in the book you'll find some references to academic works that show that even bright people like Harvard students reading two case studies, the same case study about a business person, half of them are reading it about a man, half of them are reading it about a woman, exactly the same facts. And then at the end of it, they're asked, do you like that business person? Would you go and work for that business person? And on exactly the same facts, they give the man a higher score than the woman. There are cultural stereotypes, whispering to us, and we've got to work our way through them. And even as we do that, I always want to remind, whilst we've got more work to do for women's equality, we should never forget we live in a very privileged place, and in so many parts of the world the discussion that's being had isn't the sophisticated one about women's leadership and the next stage that we've been having tonight. It's the discussion about whether or not you're going to get shot or kidnapped if you try and go to school. And the security situation we just talked about, it's a security situation, terrorism a manifestation of course, but this is an ideology that is about the subjugation of women. These things have to be, even in our world, our very privileged existence, have to be confronted and fought and addressed. And as we're having these discussions about ourselves, we need to also be doing everything we can to change that set of barriers, tremendous barriers for women in the world that we live in.
Thank you. How nice it is to talk civilly and honestly about things that matter, hey? Julie, your book, you talk about it's written through your eyes, but I hope you won't mind me saying that seeing our country and our times through your eyes tells us more than a little about ourselves. Ladies and gentlemen, Julia Gillard.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very nice.
Thank you, Eric, Miss Gillard. What an extraordinary evening it's been. I'd like to now invite Gabrielle Trainor to speak on behalf of the board of the Whitlam Institute.
Thank you very much, Amy. It's a tremendous pleasure to have been asked to thank Julia Gillard on behalf of the Whitlam Institute and on behalf of all of us here tonight. I first met Julia back in 1996 when she became Chief of Staff to the then Victorian opposition leader John Brumby. So that means I've now known her for the best part of 20 years. But I think particularly after tonight's conversation that everybody here, whether they've actually met Julia or not, and of course there's always the book queue later, that everybody feels like they know her. We've followed in detail her very public life. Throughout that life, she has spoken to us, looking us squarely in the eye, time and time again. No wonder her book is selling like hotcakes. No wonder people are turning out in such numbers to hear her speak. Millions of us refer to her simply as Julia. It's through the features of her personality that we feel we can relate to her. Her openness, her willingness to admit mistakes, her wonderful sense of humour, her straightforwardness, her lack of pretension, and we've seen all of that in spades tonight. We get the strong sense that this is a person who's not only connecting with us, but who wants to connect with us, not as a confected politician, not a cardboard cutout type of person, such as we often see. For the most obvious of reasons, of course, her gender has played a dominant part in her public persona. One doesn't become the first woman Prime Minister, go through the relentless sexist pressure that she did, respond in a notable speech that has attracted 2.6 million hits on YouTube and has even been made into a song without that happening. But I've always thought that for Julia to be considered primarily in terms of her gender somewhat loses sight of her as a person of great conviction, and I think we've heard her speak very well about that conviction tonight. Her clarity of purpose, her commitment to a strong, smart, fair Australia, her intellect and her quality have enabled her to achieve the kind of things that most people can only dream of. As it was so emphatically with Prime Minister Whitlam himself, we've never been in doubt for an instant, really, about Julia's core beliefs. I think that Alan Milband's statement of purpose must have been a snack for you to write. Better education, social equity, opportunity, a place in the world of which we as Australians can be proud. These principles are clearly in her DNA, as they are in Goff's. She fought for them, she still fights for them, and from them she will never waver. Now, people often talk about Julia's extraordinary composure. These people have clearly not seen her at a game when the Western Bulldogs are 5 points down with 3 minutes to go. But football aside, Julia's composure shows itself as charm and equanimity. Her composure was a key reason that she could not only form a minority government, but achieve in it. She was composed when she was late for an important NATO meeting in Chicago because of engine trouble, or if you believe the Northern Territory Herald, because the pilots were drunk. She even remained composed when Craig Emerson quaffed a glass of water, in which were sitting her contact lenses, and polished off the lot. This left Julia with bat-like vision impairment as she gave a major policy speech at an ALP conference. Craig later described it as one of the benefits of hindsight. But Julia remained serene. In the difficult times, Julia's composure has manifested itself as dignity and resolve. Who can forget the way she told the nation of the serial deaths of soldiers in Afghanistan? Who can forget how she speaks of her father? Who can forget her first speech as Prime Minister and her final one? We at the Whitlam Institute don't quote Margaret Thatcher all that often, but she did say, being Prime Minister is a lonely job. You cannot lead from the crowd. I think Julia would agree. She led from that lonely place out in front, armed with her strength and her conviction. So Julia, on behalf of the Whitlam Institute and of all of us here tonight, we're grateful for that leadership, we're grateful for your legacy, and we are very grateful for your being among us here and sharing so much with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. It feels like a book.
Pre-signed.